welcome back to the sixth episode of Bowl SSC. I, Ishita Jain, your today's host on behalf of Enactus Sri Aurobindo, am here to kickstart our next episode of the podcast entitled as Bowl SSC. I welcome all of you and duly extend my heartiest greetings to all. As the famous phrase goes, today's world is shrinking. And the direct implication of that is there is no such field knowing about which will be of no use to you. Every topic is meant to be unraveled. Every stone is meant to be turned. Being said so, we are here to embark on this journey through this series of podcasts. I would like to introduce you all to our today's guest, Sreedhar Vijaykrishnan. Good morning, sir.
Yeah, morning, and thank you so much for inviting me to this podcast.
He's a biologist studying wild Asian elephant behavior and physiology in human use landscapes, particularly in anomalies of the Western Ghats. Sridhar is someone who believes in adopting multidisciplinary approaches involving behavior, physiology, demography, and genetics in understanding how elephants respond to the conflict with humans. He is also deeply interested in unraveling the historic and cultural aspects of human-elephant relationships in India, as practiced by generations of Mahouts, particularly in Kerala, and as portrayed in the classical literary works of the past. So let's tap into Mr. Sridhar's immense knowledge of the animal and learn about the coexistence of humans and animals. So, sir, how will you explain the term human-animal coexistence? And how necessary is this coexistence according to you? What needs to be done to secure the future of both humans as well as animals?
See, Ishita, that's a very important question because, as you rightly indicated at the beginning of this podcast, one of the challenging things today is the increasing anthropogenic pressures on remnant natural habitats, which has led to extensive habitat fragmentation and loss, which has significantly affected a wide range of species. And elephant is perhaps one of the most affected of that lot. But that said, elephants are also one of the most adaptable species, which is also the reason why you tend to see elephants in suburbs and rural areas very close to human habitations. Now, as a result of this habitat fragmentation, or human wildlife interface is also widening, thereby resulting in a lot more frequent interactions between both protagonists. And this often is also manifested in form of negative interactions, which is widely termed as human wildlife conflict, which is what we are currently talking about as well. Now, what happens is one thing that we need to begin with, one thing that we really need to understand, we need to really acknowledge is the fact that going forward, there is perhaps no way for us to bring conflict down to zero, because our requirement for natural resources is not going down, including requirement for space, considering that our population is constantly increasing, and at the same time we cannot jeopardize the lives of these animals as well. We need to like hold on to whatever wildlife and wild spaces that we have. So in such a context, conflict to a certain extent is inevitable. Now the key is in trying to see how best we can change this conflict into coexistence. While it all sounds like a great idea, conflict, the whole concept of coexistence may not be practical everywhere. But there are many landscapes where coexistence is a possibility, which has already been demonstrated successfully. So in a realistic world where your conflict is, or your human wildlife interactions is going to be inevitable, we really need to start exploring more ways of ensuring coexistence between the two species.
So, sir, you have keen interest in the big mammals, the elephants, right? And you have studied at large about their behavior and written about how certain behavioral patterns of them mean something. So, what do you think? Can this be extended to other animals as well?
You can certainly draw a lot of parallels between elephants and a few other species, but I would as a biologist, as someone trained in science, I would be really careful in generalizing certain concepts, generalizing these findings, or generalizing these ideas, because even within elephants, for example, you have a lot of landscape level variation. What you see in the southern Western Ghats might not be what you would otherwise see in northern Western Ghats, as an example, for instance. So even at a species level, if your generalization requires so much of care and attention from our end, I don't really need to explain how careful we need to be when it comes to other species. But fundamentally, there is something common that I tend to understand in this whole human wildlife interface involving multiple other species, which is the fact that uh, the whole problem of conflict is often site specific, and our approach towards mitigating conflict or negative interactions needs to start from understanding the spatio-temporal patterns of the problem, the circumstances of several of these conflict instances, and then deciding on appropriate mitigation strategies, rather than saying that putting up fences just solves conflict, or putting up some physical barrier solves conflict between humans and wildlife of different kinds. So that doesn't apply at all. So I think the key point here, or the key common point here, is that whatever species it may be, the problem is site specific. So the one thing we really need to understand is human wildlife conflict is by and large not a wildlife problem. It's a human problem. It's a social problem. So if you try and understand more from a human perspective, because there's a limit to which you can understand the problem from an animal's perspective. You can do all sorts of science, you can do animal behavioral studies and so on, but you're still limited by the fact that you will probably never understand how the animal perceives the problem. So but at the same time, you can always understand how the human perceives the problem. So efforts should definitely be understanding it from that perspective, and devising mitigation strategies from that perspective alone. Now, what happens is that very often we understand the problem from human perspective and then devise mitigation strategies for the animals. Like, you understand that, oh, because people and elephants share spaces, they get into conflict. So let's put up a barrier for the elephants. No, that's simply not how it works. It has to be site specific, and there has to be a lot of efforts in understanding the problem at ground level that goes behind it.
Uh, right, sir. So, as a society, we try to incorporate different UNDP goals in our projects. Goal number 15 of UNDP talks about life on land, which basically focuses on protection, restoration, and promotion of sustainable use of terrestrial ecosystems and forests. So, sir, what do you think? Is coexistence between animals and humans also an underlying prospect of the goal?
See, as I said earlier, human wildlife coexistence, the conceptually speaking, it is in some sense a state wherein both protagonists are at minimal loss in some sense, because right now, the reason why we call it human wildlife conflict is because both parties are at loss. Now, the best possible measure that mitigates losses on either sides can perhaps be called as as an exemplary coexistence initiative. So that is something that we really need to think about. There would certainly be circumstances where, so again, as in the case of many other concepts in this whole area, your coexistence is also not a concept that you can probably generalize and say that coexistence is applicable everywhere. It perhaps may not be applicable everywhere. There could be areas where whatever mitigation measures you apply, coexistence simply may not be possible. At the end of the day, we are dealing with large and potentially dangerous conflict prone animals such as elephants, tigers, leopards, and so on. So one wouldn't want to, like, uh, it is definitely a very in some sense a very fancy concept to promote, in terms of yes, we need coexistence. uh, I agree. We really need to see wherever coexistence is possible, we initiate that. But for other places, we need to have other conflict mitigation measures in place. Like for instance, to give you an example, you can't have these large mammals such as elephants in urban spaces. That's simply an because it also also affects the tolerance of local community. As you know, as long as we have support from local stakeholders, conservation of these species is a possibility in the longer run. But when you have constant negative interactions between the species and humans, automatically that erodes local tolerance, which further on, in some sense, jeopardizes the overarching goal of long-term conservation. And the simplest example would be, if a snake gets into a house, people are intolerant. People want that snake taken away immediately. I don't even want to call it conflict here, but the point is that even we wouldn't want to have a snake inside our house simply because of the safety concerns. Now, think about it more from a farmer's perspective. Like, if a farmer has elephants coming into his backyard every night, or leopards coming and picking up his livestock, that is something that he may not want to really, tolerate on a regular basis. So, coexistence in such contexts is when we are able to address their problems systematically, their problems, in a sustainable manner, sustainable, effective manner. So you need to have really proven mitigation measures that have really high levels of efficacy.
So, but humans and animals have been coexisting since a very long time. Why has this become a problem now?
No, see, coexistence has happened in the past. It is happening now. As I said earlier, there are some landscapes from where we really have positive coexistence examples, which gives us a lot of hope. In terms of perhaps trying it out in other potential similar landscapes. But that doesn't necessarily mean that we haven't had conflict in the past. For example, one of the oldest textbooks on humans, called the Gajya Shastra, which is written in Sanskrit, uh, starts from a conversation between the king of the kingdom of Anga, which is present day central India, about how elephants have been destroying farmlands in his kingdom, and the peasants are seeking help from the king in resolving this problem. So clearly, if there weren't issues similar to this in the past, you wouldn't have writings such as these. I mean, nobody's going to imagine that you're coming and destroying crops. So, we have such examples, and like for example, we have been talking about elephants coming and raiding crops, or feeding on agricultural crops in large groups. And I've heard a lot of theories saying this is all a new phenomenon and so on. But if you actually look at writings from the colonial era, you would find evidence where people have written about the same from late 1700s onwards. So we have close to 200, 300 years of written scientific, at least scientific or natural history evidences of elephants coming into problems, or other species getting into conflict with humans. So there's been conflict, there's been coexistence in the past, and that is how it is even today. But what has by and large changed is that over the years, we have lost significant amount of habitats. Now, if you look at it, more from a satellite data point of view, if you see elephant habitats in particular, we have lost close to 50% of Asian elephant habitats across the 13 range countries that supports the species. Now that is a huge number. That is challenging, and in places like India and Sri Lanka, for example, like Sri Lanka, now we have evidence which shows that 85% of your elephant population in Sri Lanka are outside protected areas. We have similar examples from India, and by and large, all our conservation efforts, all our conflict mitigation efforts, or all our any of our species management efforts have all been protected area centric. So when we have populations outside these protected areas because of habitat loss and fragmentation, our management strategies also need to be tailored accordingly. So, as I said earlier, coexistence has conflict has been there in the past. We have conflict now, and we are bound to have conflict in the future also, considering the overlapping spatio-temporal patterns between the species and potential competition in the future for resources. Likewise, we have had coexistence in the past. We are having coexistence now, and coexistence is one of the major ways forward if we are to ensure that we have good populations, good and stable populations of wildlife as well.
Right. So clearly, sir, there is no single solution to this issue. So what needs to be done? What is lacking in our efforts? What does the future look like for animal-human coexistence in India? And are you optimistic about it?
See, I don't. If I am to be pessimistic, I should just wrap up the work that I'm doing right now, and then
Right.
probably not continue it anymore. If I'm being extremely pessimistic, then I can just conclude saying, okay, there's going to be no future for elephants. There's no point putting in any efforts to save the species. There's no point, putting in any efforts to mitigate conflict. The whole idea behind a lot of us working in this field is that there is some ray of hope, even if it is dim, there is some light at the end of the tunnel. So the whole point is all our efforts need to be channelized in the right direction, and any conservation or conflict mitigation effort needs to be science based. As you rightly indicated in your question, there's no one-stop solution for any of these problems. It is all site specific. I mean, it's easy. One of the easy ways in which we have been seeing conflict. So if you look at it, as I mentioned earlier, conflict is often portrayed as a problem from the animal side, which is also the reason why you have what is called as problem animal approach. You look at elephant conflict, for instance, you have had elephants named after terrorists like Bin Laden, for instance. So the whole local notion is that the animal is dreadful, the animal is
Hmm.
terrorizing and so on. So that's clearly not the case. It's not like so no elephant is gonna like hide and search for humans and pounce on the person and kill that person. That's definitely not happening. It's all a myth that elephants have vengeance and then they kill people and so on. If you actually see most of the cases of human deaths reported in India because of elephants, uh, a large proportion of that is resulting because of accidental encounters, which are very well avoidable. For example, so in many cases, people are just unaware when they go to their farmlands, when they walk back to their homes after work at dusk, or when they are out for attending nature's calls, or you know or similar social reasons. So clearly, you know that there are particular circumstances that lead to such conflict incidents. So here there is the point, or rather, the key concept here, or the key understanding here, is that this is clearly not a problem from the animal side. It is a social problem, and it needs social solutions. It needs solutions from the people side. Like, for instance, ensuring basic sanitation could help, from prevent people from going into the woods for their daily needs. Or for example, in many places, for example, they're out in the woods collecting firewood. If there are alternatives for that, like there are beautiful examples where communities have moved out from firewood towards other biogas and LPG based solutions. So if there are ways to try and mitigate this human wildlife interface by largely modifying human behavior, because there's no way you can modify elephant behavior. It's completely unable to decide. It's not human behavior. So, and I want to really quote a successful example here. For example, there's something called the early warning systems. You can probably look it up online. It's in this landscape called Valpare in the Annamalays and the southern Western Ghats, where I worked for close to 7 years. And the early warning systems in the Anomalies has been beautifully working towards mitigating human deaths due to elephants, primarily based on the understanding that it's largely the lack of awareness about elephant presence that has led to accidental encounters between the protagonists. Uh, Now, if I say that the early warning systems have worked well in Valparai, the immediate second thought shouldn't be that, okay, why not we try it elsewhere? Why not we try it out in Odisha? Why not we try it out in Jharkhand? So clearly, that is not what happens. So the take home that I really want to convey from our understanding from the anomalies is that there's close to 10 years of research that has really gone into understanding the basic problems in that landscape, which is what helped us understand that early warning systems probably could work as a good solution there. So it's really not early warning systems that contributed towards mitigating this problem, but it is the science-based attempt at understanding the various facets of the problem that helped mitigate it, which is what we clearly need in other landscapes as well. So, which is also the reason why I was mentioning earlier that what works in southern Western Ghats may not work in central Western Ghats or work in in Assam or Arunachal or anywhere. So it all needs a site-specific approach.
Right. So, how do you think that stringent acts and rules that are being legislated that says of punishing the defaulters of causing harm to the animals actually beneficial?
It is certainly beneficial. I mean, see, if we didn't have any of these stringent legal measures, for example, people would have taken law into their arms. Like there are instances where people are absolutely frustrated because of losses due to wildlife, which is also the reason why we see a lot of killing of wildlife in retaliation or in defense. You get elephants getting electrocuted, carnivores getting poisoned, which is all by and large because of eroding tolerance. So, if we really didn't have such legal measures, the loss of our wildlife to similar issues would have been much higher. So, we really need to have those laws, to protect our wildlife species. And I think what we really also need to do is, while we ensure that legally we are putting in all possible measures to save the species, we also need to make sure that the losses incurred by the local stakeholders, by the farmers, is also reduced, is also brought down significantly, so that you have better tolerance for wildlife. In India, for example, India is one of the few countries which has a lot of cultural relationships with a lot of species. Like you have the tiger associated with goddess Durga. There are places in Maharashtra where people worship the leopard. The elephant, of course, as we all know, is associated with Lord Ganesha and so on. So there's a lot of cultural association between humans and wildlife, and many of these species are also revered. So that to a great extent has also ensured how the survival of many of these species, because it's also a cultural stigma to harm these animals. But we shouldn't probably be exploiting that cultural tolerance, and going forward all our efforts should be directed towards making sure that both the parties, not just the wildlife, both the parties, humans and wildlife, suffer minimal losses because of the rising interface.
Right, sir. So, as a last remark, I would like to ask you what advice would you like to share with our listeners who have genuine love for animals? Most of us live in urban setups and we don't really have much interaction with animals. So, what can we urbanites do for this?
I'll tell you a few things. One is, uh, as I mentioned earlier, it's the way human wildlife conflict gets reported is often very biased. It's taking either of the parties. There's never a balanced situation. So as citizens, as people who have the exposure to various kinds of these platforms, who have the ability to communicate to people, uh, folks like you, students like you, should also take the extra effort to try and understand what exactly is the situation, rather than imbibing the secondary information that you get. And in terms, so because as I said. We really need to have an attitudinal change towards human wildlife conflict. It clearly will contribute in the longer run towards mitigating the problem. And as common citizens, you can contribute in many ways by educating the other people that based on whatever limited understanding that you have, you can educate the others. You can say that there is a different facet to this problem. Perhaps we look at it from this way. And because by and large, what happens is that in many of these environmental issues, many of these ecological conservation issues, the larger problem is often not addressed. When conflict gets reported, when an environmental problem gets reported, it's often the symptoms that gets treated, not the underlying disease. The underlying disease here, the underlying concern, the underlying problem here is that of habitat fragmentation and loss, and the alarming loss of natural resources. So these are all things that you can be aware of, and you can make others aware of. You can have a fairly good network of like-minded people. You can have these awareness campaigns and so on, and you can write in other platforms about these issues and so on. Because unless we really treat, just to give you one last example before concluding, I'm not sure how many of you were aware of this issue that happened in Kerala late last year, where an elephant fed on a pineapple that was filled with explosives,
Yeah.
had its oral cavity bursted, and then finally had succumbed to the infections that followed. Now, there was huge hue and outcry in social media. There were multiple campaigns, change.org petitions to punish the culprits and so on. Yes, well and good. The perpetrators really need to be punished in such instances. But what people really don't understand there is that the farmers there probably did it out of frustration, just because of the perpetual loss of their cultivated crops to wildlife species. Even if it was so, and there was a lot of justification, which also said that it was targeted towards wild boar, and the elephant caught unexpectedly. So even if it is targeted towards wild boar, it's because people are just intolerant of the kind of losses that they are incurring because of wild boar. So the underlying problem here never got reported, which is that of huge habitat fragmentation and degradation that has happened in several of those landscapes. So while people very, vocally, vehemently argued about the different kinds of theories that floated around this issue, nobody ever even spoke about, even once spoke about the problem of habitat fragmentation or habitat loss. So one concept that you mentioned in one of your earlier questions is also of equal importance in this context, which is that of restoration. So, in many of the landscapes where habitats have been significantly fragmented because of anthropogenic activities, you have these remnant fragments, and although they are small bits and pieces, we need to really hold on to at least those bits and pieces. Make sure that efforts are on towards restoring these remnant fragments. You restore connectivity between many of these forested spaces, ensure that there are wildlife corridors, and through all of that we can ensure that we have at least some good, well connected, viable habitats for our wildlife species going forward. And even in our research, for example, we have seen how restoration of fragments has really contributed towards improving the quality of habitats, and thereafter you know those fragments supporting elephant populations. So clearly it has to be a combination of efforts in terms of understanding the problem scientifically, putting in all possible coexistence measures, putting in all possible conflict mitigation measures, try and approach a more pragmatic way, and in the same time also understand it more from a landscape perspective. Look at possibilities of reclaiming several of these lands, restoring these lands, and that combined with an attitudinal change, a positive change towards conservation, towards understanding the different problems that our environment faces in today's Anthropocene.
All right, sir. Thank you so much once again for your worthy time. I'm sure that our audience will definitely incorporate your piece of advice in their personal lives. We hope to hear from you in near future as well. That was it for today's episode of Bold SSC. Reach out to us with any questions, suggestions, and recommendations. Our podcast is telecasted on Spotify, Google Podcast, and our very own YouTube channel, Enactus Sri Aurobindo College. You can reach out to us on our official social media handles. See you all again next week, Tuesday, sharp at 8, with yet another interesting topic and an eminent guest. Till then, take care. Signing off, your host for today, Ishita. Until next time, stay home, stay safe. Thank you so much, sir.